Hello, I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm so happy to welcome George Weigel to this conversation about his book, Not Forgotten, Elegies for and Reminiscences of a Diverse Cast of Characters, most of them admirable, from Ignatius Press, and this is co-sponsored by the National Review Institute and Ignatius Press. Welcome, George. I used to run into you all the time, but it's good to see you.
Nice to see you, Kathryn, if only virtually, and I hope that when the plague abates, we will see each other a lot more frequently in person.
I look forward to that. And I want to start out by really recommending this book to anyone who's watching. It's a fun, casual kind of read that teaches and remembrances. I definitely experienced reading this because, of course, I knew some of the people in this book too. Some of these people were very close to National Review, and so I really appreciate this, and I'm grateful that you wrote it. It's easy to read, and I think people need things like that, and encouraging. It's a hopeful kind of book, and goodness knows people need that right now. So it's a great Easter book, or graduation, or Mother's or Father's Day, or anything like that. I wanted to start, George, with Bill Buckley because obviously he's important in National Review. Why did you include him in the book, and what do you remember most about him?
Kathryn, let's remind people that Not Forgotten is a collection of 68 brief memorial essays. Many of them were newspaper columns that I wrote when various friends and associates died. And it occurred to me a year ago that a collection of these might make for an interesting book, a kind of panorama of human personalities. There are people in this book from the journalism world, like Bill, from the sports world, from the church world, from the political world, from the entertainment industry. It's a real menagerie of human characters. Bill is in here because I think Bill Buckley was one of the 4 or 5 most important Catholics in the United States in the 20th century. And I think that aspect of his variegated life is not sufficiently remarked. Bill was a wonderful human being. If his shade will permit me to say so, he had a great democratic spirit, small d Democrat. He was wonderful working with young people, particularly young writers. He was immensely generous with his time and his encouragement. And he was a true gentleman. All of that, I think, reflected the depth and sincerity of his Christian faith, which was a Catholic Christian faith. He didn't wear his Catholicism on his sleeve. He didn't brag about it like certain prominent public personalities today do. But that was the bottom line for Bill. And if you're looking for an explanation of why he was so good with so many people, even people with whom he vigorously disagreed, I think it was because he had internalized the idea that everyone he met was a someone for whom the Son of God had become incarnate, suffered, died, and was raised from the dead. So Bill's democratic spirit, small d, was a reflection of his Christian conviction. He was also of enormous importance for the obvious reason that he largely, not single-handedly, but largely created what is now referred to as fusion conservatism, and that made the Reagan Revolution possible. And at this moment in history, when the conservative movement has turned into a circular firing squad, it's important to remember the importance of big tents. Big tents don't necessarily include everybody. Bill Buckley drove the anti-Semites out of the conservative movement. He drove the conspiracy theorist crazies out of the conservative movement. But he was willing to have real arguments within that big tent. And this process of mutual excommunication that's going on right now is something that I think he would have found both sad and deplorable. So it's good to remember him in 1,200 words or so in Not Forgotten.
I loved that when you talked about how many people thought of him as a friend. I remember the day he died. First of all, one of the first people who emailed me was you, and you made the point about him being one of the top 5 Catholic public intellectuals of the century. And but I will never forget how many people wrote into me who met him once, you know, when he spoke at their college campus or at the airport or whatever it is, and one after one would say he treated me like I was the most important person in the world. So I love that you captured that about him. You also, related to Bill, you have a remembrance of Father Richard John Newhouse, and you point out that their friendship began when Father Newhouse chastised Bill about the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, I mean, one of the threads, one of the bright threads uniting most of these 68 characters in Not Forgotten, Kathryn, is a certain generosity of spirit, generosity with time, generosity with care for other people. And Father Newhouse was every bit as generous with his time as Bill Buckley was with his, and that was, I think, a human bond between them. That story you tell, which I relate in this book, is an important one. Bill, for reasons that I think he later came to regret, opposed at the time the 1964 Civil Rights Act on constitutional grounds. Richard Newhouse was then Pastor Newhouse, working in a Black and Hispanic, very poor area of Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, where no one short of a millionaire can afford a house now. Right. And he wrote Bill a letter saying, "You're wrong." And these two robust personalities got together for lunch and started a conversation that went on for the next 3 decades. That's a pattern of forming friendships that has been lost. I think, too much in our country today. And recovering that kind of civility is important, but it can only be done by people who have that generous spirit that I spoke about a moment ago.
And a fundamental respect for people, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that they have free will, God gives it to us. So how did you decide? Obviously, some of these were published before. How did you decide who you were going to include in your?
Well, I had let me back this up just a bit. In 2018 and 2019, it occurred to me, probably as a reflection on my own mortality and age, that I had been writing an awful lot of obituary columns in previous years. I mean, I used to be the kid in the gang, and now I was the elder, and I was eulogizing my elders and betters at a terrific rate. And then I thought, well, actually, I've been doing this for a while, if not at such a great pace. And perhaps pulling these together might make an interesting book of the sort I described a moment ago, a kind of panorama of human personalities from very different fields. These are the 68 eulogies that I decided to include because those were the 68 I had. 2 of them actually got inserted into the book while the book was in production. Audrey Donathorne, this astonishing British woman who spent most of her life in China and was a kind of secret agent for the Catholic Church in China, in communist China, for years. And then the great Father Paul Menkowski, who died while the book was almost at the printers. But the other 66 were drawn from the things I had written in newspapers and magazines One of the essays, a reminiscence of Pope John Paul II's press spokesman, Joaquin Navarro-Valls. I had written for a book of memorial essays about him, published in Spain by his brother. And then I decided to include the tributes I had paid to my parents at their funeral masses, because I thought people might like to meet them. They were not public personalities. I think they were a bit surprised that one of their offspring became such a public personality. But they were interesting people and reflected a slice of Americana that frankly doesn't exist anymore, but that really ought to be remembered. So that's how the book was put together. I lightly edited these things so that they would read smoothly as a book. But I think it's the diversity of personalities that I found attractive here. And I as you said at the beginning, you found it an encouraging book. A lot of people have told me that, and I'm very grateful for that. It's a time in our lives when encouragement is helpful.
Well, what I also find very helpful about this book, Not Forgotten, is that I'm increasingly struck by how many young conservatives have no idea what came before, and conservatives are people who should know their history, right? What are we conserving if we don't know it? And so to introduce to people, who these characters were and what they were like and, how they lived. When you write about John Paul II in this book, I feel like I've had dinner with him, because you really give a sense of how he conducted the conversation and wasn't concerned about the trappings or the food for that matter.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk by Zoom to a group of college seminarians here in Washington, young men in their early to mid 20s. And one of these fellows said during the discussion, he said, the first time I saw you was when you were part of NBC's broadcast of the funeral of John Paul II, and I was watching it while I was in the first grade. Mamma mia.
Did not need to tell you that.
Well, I mean, in addition to making me feel like I should go have a slug of Geritol or something, I thought, this young man has no living memory of the greatest figure in the past 500 years of Catholic history who lived in his lifetime.
Right.
So John Paul II, as you know, in Not Forgotten, gets 2 entries. One of them was the piece the Wall Street Journal had asked me for. The other was a piece commissioned by Newsweek. And I tried in them to let readers get to know him from the inside, which is actually a leitmotif of the entire book. You cannot really understand somebody from the outside only. And since in our present debased public conversation, it's just exchanges of snark on the outside. Right. It's good to be reminded of the need to try to understand people from the inside, including as they understood themselves. What you say about a lack of a knowledge of history is exactly right, and it's killing us. Mm-hmm. We're dying from the historical stupids in the United States. And if this little book helps remind people of some pretty relevant contemporary history, whether that's Anwar Sadat or Václav Havel or Pat Moynihan or Sargent Shriver or Lindy Boggs or Henry Hyde or Scoop Jackson or Jackie Robinson. Those are important things to know. You can't understand where we are today unless you understand how we got here.
Right.
And you can't understand where we should be going unless you have some understanding of where we've been. So if this is a good little dip into reading history and biography, I'm happy for it. We seem to have a problem here.
Hello, we're working on getting Kathryn's video unfrozen. She'll be back in just a moment.
Okay.
Apologies for that.
Well,
There we go.
Sorry about that. Before we got disconnected here, Henry Hyde, what would you want young people to know about him who are active in the pro-life movement, but again, don't know this character from 12 seconds ago, it seems?
I worked with Henry closely for 25 years. He was a remarkable character, a big man in every way. We're having this conversation during the NCAA basketball tournaments. Very few people, including people who think they know the life of Henry Hyde, know that he played in one of those, that he was a basketball star at Georgetown as an undergraduate before he went into the Navy in the Second World War. Henry is worth remembering for many, many things, including his sterling human qualities. But I think Henry, Scoop Jackson, Lindy Boggs, Sergeant Shriver, Pat Moynihan, other political figures in this book are especially worth remembering today because these were all people who saw public office as a way to get something done for the common good. They did not think of politics as performance art. I could no more imagine Scoop Jackson tweeting than I could imagine flapping my wings and flying to the moon. And good for Scoop for being unimaginable as a tweeter. These were all very serious people. They were also a lot of fun. I mean, being serious and having a lot of fun are not mutually exclusive. But we're in a moment where people are entering politics to get distinction rather than bringing distinction to politics, and that's real trouble in a democracy. So the other thing I might say about Henry is that while he was disdained by some, including the so-called pro-choicers, whom he regularly demolished and debayed, he was hated by no one, I don't think. He was a genuinely lovable human being. He was not a hater. I mean, he could be fierce in debate, but he was not a hater. And he loved the Congress. I mean, he thought the House was indeed the people's house. And I think if he saw the Capitol today, I mean, surrounded by fences and barbed wire and going through a gazillion security checks to get in and out, he would be deeply saddened.
And some of the comic figures that you really have in Congress right now. It's almost laughable to young people to think that politics was once a noble profession, you know?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And I probably reveal myself as the troglodyte I am, but I think social media has, in the main, proven to be a curse rather than an embellishment of our public life. I refuse to have anything to do with Twitter or Facebook for that matter, but I just refuse to conduct serious discussions in that kind of format which is inherently demagogic. Twitter is inherently demagogic. And I don't see any point in participating in that. And I do wish at some point, I hope, that our political culture is going to grow out of that. I hope that's the case. I'm not suggesting we have to go back to Lincoln and Douglas and 6, 7, 8 hour debates in 1858. It would be nice to think that our public officials could carry on a coherent argument for 6 to 8 hours. But we're dumbing ourselves down. And since argument is the lifeblood of democracy, that means the democracy is getting a bit blood weary, tired blood.
I remember it was probably 10 years ago or so. I was conducting some kind of weekend program, and we had books for the young people, probably in their 20s, and they wanted to know if there was an e-version. And there's nothing wrong with e-versions, but there's nothing like having a book in your hands, like Not Forgotten by George Weigel, which we're discussing right now.
A year ago, about 2 years ago, before the plague descended, I was having lunch with a friend of mine whom I'm helping on a biography of Cardinal Spellman of New York. I think it'll be a very interesting book. Spellman is a political actor. And anyway, this fellow teaches at UMass Boston. And among other reasons he and I are friends is that he teaches the history of baseball at UMass Boston. And I said, so what are the books you assign? And he said, what did you say? I said, what are the books you assign? He said, if I assign more than one book and one article in this course, nobody would take it.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Houston, we have a problem.
So you mentioned your love of sports. You've got football in here, you've got baseball in here, you've got Pioneer 10 in here.
Yeah.
You described Bill Buckley as some little boy in him and rebel. That described you too?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. I mean, people ask me about my friendship with Charles Krauthammer, who's one of the figures in this book. Well, I mean, that was cemented in many respects, but part of the cement was baseball, and another part of it was we were both space nuts. And one of the many reasons to miss Charles is that he would have been beside himself with happiness over the Perseverance landing on Mars a couple of weeks ago, which I had to watch the whole live feed of that. I mean, I was just having a very good time. The little piece on Pioneer 10, which was the first human-made artifact to leave our solar system, and is still alive. Pioneer 10 is the only thing memorialized in this book that's not dead yet. And it was an occasion to think about, the nature of the cosmos, its extraordinary expanse, the divine origins of it all. So that's why Pioneer 10 made the cut, even though it's not dead yet.
Going back to politicians, I actually got weepy as I was reading the chapter on Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great what if of American Catholicism and politics, American history, because things could have changed if he took some stands in his party, as you describe it. I also was struck by, as I was reading it, he would have been totally canceled by his party in this current environment. Totally. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, there are actually two great what ifs, although Pat's the only one who gets the title in this. The other is Sergeant Shriver. They were two very different personalities, but both were expressions of Catholic America. Pat, very, very Irish. Sarge is Sarge Shriver's people went back to the earliest days of the colony of Maryland and the state of Maryland during the Revolutionary War. Let's do it chronologically and begin with Sarge. Suppose LBJ had taken Sergeant Shriver, of whom he was enamored, on the ticket in 1964 as the vice presidential candidate. Now, Robert Kennedy and others in the family had said to Sergeant Shriver, if there's anybody in this family going to be on that ticket, it's going to be Bobby, not you. So he was, in a sense, vetoed by his in-laws. But suppose LBJ had said, I don't care about that, I'm taking Sarge. Then you would have had a pro-life Catholic, even if Nixon had won I'm sorry, 64. You would have had a pro-life Catholic vice president who would have been the natural successor to Lyndon Johnson, going into the era that gave us Roe versus Wade. Now, Sarge, of course, remained a solid pro-lifer, as did his wife, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, his whole life, although he could never bring himself to break with the Democratic Party, which might have had another interesting result. Pat Moynihan, I think, was one of the most brilliant people in American public life in the 20th century. He was a terrific social scientist. He foresaw the disaster that the breakdown of family life in interurban communities has created across the country. And he got sort of pre-canceled or canceled before canceling was cool for pointing all that out. He was a robust defender of freedom at the United Nations when he was Gerald Ford's ambassador to the UN. His 4 terms in the Senate, I think, were a disappointment. He never could get over his fear of the New York Times, which never got over its distaste for Pat Moynihan. There was a brutal Democratic senatorial primary in New York in '76, Pat Moynihan versus Bella Abzug, sort of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez 1.0, a real hard lefty. And Time supported Bella. Pat won the primary by a hair's breadth and won 4 straight general elections, but he was always afraid of the Times. And of course, the Times is fanatically pro-choice. And I think that muted his voice considerably on what he had to know was a great civil rights issue. Now, at the end, he supported the ban on partial birth abortion, saying it's too close to infanticide. Well, of course, it is infanticide. Maybe he had some regrets at the end about all of that. But I have to say that those of us who thought Pat Moynihan could bring Catholic social doctrine to life at the higher altitudes of American national politics have to have been disappointed by his senatorial career.
It's amazing to think, that even given his public positions at the end, he said, all right, this is too much. But the Democratic Party has even gone beyond that now, talking about let the baby die, with comfort, as the governor of Virginia did, a medical doctor. You talk in a couple of these entries about redemptive suffering. Don Briel, who we both knew, that's sort of how you start out. This is real death with dignity, to die die naturally, die according to God's plan. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There are several characters in this book who exemplify the truth of redemptive suffering. Don Briel was certainly one of them. Cardinal Francis George was another. Cardinal George said to me at the beginnings of the euthanasia debate in the country 10 or 15 years ago, we were having lunch one day, and he said, you know, we're going to have to spend the rest of our lives explaining that suffering and death are good for you. And that's going to be tough. I said, yeah, you're right, it is. I think it's a sign of the profound cultural de-Christianization of our society that this sounds like such a bizarre idea today. Because if this truly were a Christian culture, it would understand that the only path to Easter is through Good Friday. There's no, you know, go straight to Easter card in the deck of the game of life. And I think people like Cardinal George and Don Briel were able to live through physical suffering. Cardinal George for virtually his entire life as a post-polio person, because they conformed their suffering to the suffering of Christ on the cross and identified themselves with him, and through that identification believed that they were participating in ways that they could not know or perhaps even understand in Christ's ongoing redemption of the world. They lived it different ways. Cardinal George, as I said, lived for 60 years with 40 pounds of steel wrapped around his legs in order to walk, after spending some of his youth in an iron lung. Don was a different case. Don Briel was it seemed to be perfectly robust health when I called him shortly after Christmas one year, and just to get caught up, and I said, how you doing? He said, well, I had this blood work done recently, and it seems I have leukemia. And then, you know, we discussed various treatment options. And then a couple of days later, he calls me back and says, well, I've just been told I'm one of the 100 people in recorded medical history who have 2 forms of leukemia at once. There's nothing to be done, and I'm going to be dead in a month. And we proceeded to have a talk about, you know, what novels do you read? What single malt scotches do you try? If you know the clock is running and you got 30 days here. And it was the most extraordinary dying. Don, for those who don't know the name, was a great educator, created the model Catholic Studies program in the country at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities. That program had produced great marriages. It had also produced one religious order of sisters and a whole lot of priests. And it was the sisters who took care of Don Briel in his home, turned into a hospice in his last month, and the priests who came and said he had trained, who came and said Mass for him every day. It was the most extraordinary example of the communion of saints gathering around someone. I spoke to him the night before he died, and he was ready, and he had regarded the previous month as a great grace that he'd been able to see so many old friends, his family, his grandchildren again. Yes, in a society where we increasingly think we can fix this by the technological fix of the old Mickey Finn here, physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, learning how to die well is a lesson that some of the characters in this book, Not Forgotten, teach us.
And how do we, you started to get into it when you were talking about Don, how do we suffer with people? Because I think that's something, that's why assisted suicide is possible, right? Why it captures people's as a proper response, because we don't know how to suffer with people. Apparently it's talking about single malt scotch and novels to some extent.
Well, that's those are not the only ways. Obviously, praying with people, just conversation, presence. I think what the hospice movement at its best is one of the really impressive social movements of our time. Just like it's at the end of the life spectrum from the crisis pregnancy center movement. I mean, in both of these instances, abortion and euthanasia are technological fixes, or alleged technological fixes, for what are basically human problems, which can be solved by companionship and compassion, and what Pope Francis calls accompaniment, which, by the way, was what John Paul II called his ministry to young people in the late 1940s. That's not a new invention in the Catholic world. And I think that that ministry of accompaniment in suffering, just being with somebody, is a very large part of the human answer to this problem.
You mentioned, talking about John Paul II again, you mentioned that when asked about foundational influences and things in his priesthood, he talked about friendships. He didn't talk about seminary classes or anything, and that's something too, isn't it, that all this social media stuff has drawn us away from. And you mentioned earlier, the generosity of spirit that some of these people had, making time for people. You're good at that. I know many stories where, somebody caught your eye with maybe a review of one of your books, or just, because of their writing or whatever, and you take them out to lunch, and that's a really important thing that I think we've lost sight of. Writing notes. Bill Buckley always responded to notes.
Yeah. Well, I'm very old-fashioned about that. I mean, I think if people write me, even if they write me what I regard as idiotic or overly aggressive things, they deserve a response. It was Don Briel, to go back to Don a minute, who pointed out long before anybody had heard of Twitter and Facebook, pointed out to me, said, you ever notice these kids on campus today? They don't date. There's nothing like courtship anymore. They travel in packs. And I said, well, why do you think that is? He says, it's the sexual revolution. Packs are for protection. In a pack, you're protected from whatever untoward expectations you are concerned you might run into. And that's another huge sorrow. I mean, boy-girl friendship has just evaporated in this society. But then so have so many other forms of friendship, as you say, precisely because of the ubiquity of these things, which are not substitutes. I mean, they just cannot be substitutes. I think some of those watching, you certainly know about the program I've been privileged to be part of for almost 30 years in Poland every summer, the Tertio Millennio Seminar in the Free Society, kind of 3-week crash course in Catholic social doctrine. One of the reasons that is such a transformative experience for our students is because it's an experience of real conversation. I mean, it's all conversation all the time. And that's a rarer and rarer experience, I think.
I would certainly hope that the experience of the last year would drive that home for people, but there's nothing like being present and real human interaction. I just want to say to the people who are joining us here, feel free to put questions in the chat box for George Weigel about his book, Not Forgotten. And George, can you talk about Chuck Colson a little bit, who you describe as, you've never met a more thoroughly converted Christian. Tell us.
No, I begin that elegy for Chuck Colson, I think, in the following terms. In the days when Chuck Colson said he would run over his grandmother for Richard Nixon, I would happily have done the same to Mr. Colson. I mean, in my callow youth, I thought he was an awful guy. And then there we are 20 years later, 25 years later, working together in a variety of projects, including the project Evangelicals and Catholics Together. I have never met anyone, I don't think, who had an adult conversion quite as intense and thorough as Chuck Colson. I mean, his prison experience after Watergate was the transformative experience of his life. And he then followed that up by a very serious study of theology, so that he was not simply emotionally converted, if you will, but intellectually converted as well, and had a real grasp of what I would call the intellectual architecture of great tradition Christianity. Prison Fellowship, the ministry that Chuck started, is one of the great Christian ministries of our time. It's the best thing that has happened to the American penal system in my lifetime. It is remarkably successful. And the fact that it gets attacked for somehow violating the First Amendment in ways that only the crazy people who would think such a thing could imagine is a real sadness, because what Prison Fellowship has demonstrated is that you really can rehabilitate people who have had lives of extensive criminal activity. So Chuck was a multifaceted character, and to the end of his life remained, I think, a very shrewd politician. But it was the intensity and depth of that conversion that attracted me to him, and makes him someone very much worth remembering.
I don't know if I fully appreciated or forgot how much he suffered because of Evangelicals and Catholics Together. Funds stopped coming in, donors quit his efforts, and the ministry does strike me as one of the most Christian thing. I mean, so many people couldn't care less about the people in prison, and so he was a real important part of the last century, and again, someone I fear is being forgotten. Why it's really important that you put this book together.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, Prison Fellowship continues. There's the Colson Center, which carries on various aspects of his work. Chuck was a singular personality, and you just can't, it's like Richard Newhouse or Mike Novak or Bill Buckley. These are not, replicable personalities. But to remember what they stood for and why they could be as compelling as they were, ought to inspire the rest of us.
You reminded me when I was rereading this book, reading your remembrance of Michael Novak, I still owe him a lunch, because there was some bet on it was both, I made the wrong call on the World Series and the presidential election, and so I was supposed to buy him lunch. So hopefully in heaven I can make good on that. I totally forgot that. Among the people who are not, headliners, so to speak, in this book, who among these people would you really want readers to have take away with them and really have an impact on their lives?
I'm just looking through the table, looking through the table of contents myself. Jim Billington, former Librarian of Congress, a real example of what public service means. Cardinal Lustiger, mm-hmm. the former Archbishop of Paris, born of Jewish parents, remarkable human personality. Max Campbellman. Max Campbellman was a very important figure in the latter years of the Reagan administration as his nuclear arms negotiator. But Max was another one of these people for whom public life was about getting things done, not about self-expression. Jan Novak. Jan Novak was a Polish resistance courier during the Second World War, crossed Nazi-occupied Europe 4 or 5 times, told Churchill about the impending Warsaw Uprising, went back to Warsaw to participate in the uprising, knowing it wasn't going to get any help, and then ran the Polish section of Radio Free Europe for many years before coming to Washington and becoming a fixture on the Washington scene for some 20 years. He was a kind of medieval knight brought into the 20th century. Herman Wouk. You know, people still read Herman's books, but as we're having this conversation during Passover, it's worth telling a story in the book where I had called Herman once to congratulate him on a new novel he had written at age 98 or something called A Big Hole in Texas, which was a fantastic send-up of the pomposities of science, government, and everything else. And I read it in one sitting. And I mean, I had been sent to galleys, and I just sat down one night at 8 o'clock, and I had finished it by 11 o'clock. So the next day, it was a Saturday, I called Herman, and I forgot about the important thing. Of course, we're 3 hours ahead of California here, where he was living at the time. So I called about 8 o'clock our time, 5 o'clock out there. The sun hadn't set. So the housekeeper answers the phone and says, "Mr. Wouk will be happy to take your call after the Sabbath." That was impressive. That was impressive. So there are all sorts of interesting people here, including, some sports folks from my youth who are worth remembering.
Well, there's one football player who I'm not finding the entry, but you make the point about him that it's possible to be in sports and be a good Catholic man.
Yeah, well, it's actually 2 of them. Jim Mutchler, who was a tight end for the Baltimore Colts, as we remember them, not that city in the Midwest which stole them some time ago. And Gino Marchetti, who was a defensive end on the 1958 Colts championship team. They were both serious Catholics. And it had a lot to do with their ability to be parts of a team. Catholicism has a communitarian ethic built into it. And I think those guys who were, the Catholic sports heroes of my youth, we're talking about when I was in the 2nd grade here, or the 3rd grade or whatever, remain inspiring figures today. So Catholicism and manliness go together. There's nothing inherently wimpish about serious Catholic faith.
Didn't you write an essay about that in one of your books? That's an essay collection, name that escapes me, about Catholicism and manliness. If
I
not,
could have. I mean,
if
I'm
not, we'll be assigning it to you.
I'm at the point of my authorial life when people have to remind me what I've done.
It's not a bad thing. It speaks to a lot of fruitfulness. If we can talk about John Paul II just a little bit more, you talk about how he would have like these mystical experiences that he couldn't even put into words, and how people were so impressed by the experience of seeing him and hearing him pray. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, of course, struck me when I spent 3 years writing Witness to Hope, the first volume of my John Paul II biography. And then it re-struck me when I was doing the second volume, The End and the Beginning. And people would ask me, do you really know him? And I would say yes, as well as I think he can be known, but there is a depth level of his life that he can't talk about, because it's a realm of experience, call it mystical experience if you like, that is before words or beyond words or nonverbal or however you want to describe it. It's what the mystics call spiritual communion with God. And he was gifted that way, so that when you would go into his chapel in the papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace in Rome for the early morning mass, I mean, he would literally be groaning in prayer. And you begin to get an understanding what St. Paul talks about when he talks about, the Spirit prays within us in groanings too deep for words. And then, he would be there and with you and all the rest of it. It's very important for people to understand that John Paul II prayed his way into everything he did, whether it was in the church, in the intellectual life, on the international stage. That was all the fruit of his prayer. And that actually brings me to another story, which I don't think is in the book, but it involves a character in the book. We were just talking about Cardinal Lustiger of Paris. Lustiger was, as I said, the son of Jewish parents who converted to Catholicism as a teenager, became a priest, was the chaplain at the Sorbonne, and then was named the Bishop of Orleans. The Archbishop of Paris had died. John Paul II had to appoint a new Archbishop of Paris, and he wanted to appoint Lustiger. So he thought he was the kind of guy who could revivify the church in France. And so the Apostolic Nuncio in France goes to Orleans and says to Lustiger, the Holy Father intends to appoint you the Archbishop of Paris. Lustiger says he can't do that. It's impossible. A man with my background, meaning this Jewish family background, cannot be the Archbishop of Paris. So the nuncio reports this back to Rome, and the Pope sends his secretary, Monsignor Jewish, to see Lustiger. And Monsignor Jewish says to Lustiger, Bishop, you are the fruit of the prayer of the Holy Father. He prayed his way into this decision that you should go to Paris. Well, what's Lustiger going to say to that? So he agrees and goes to Paris and is the Archbishop for over 20 years and was marvelous at it. John Paul II was brilliant. He was shrewd. But above all, he prayed his way into the things he did. And that's important to remember as we're sitting here during Holy Week.
We have a question from someone who is wondering what your favorite biographies are. And I wanted to ask that in part because I want to know what you and Don Briel talked about the novel.
The novel's very simple. I suggested that he read Evelyn Waugh's Helena. which is a kind of experimental novel. It's not well regarded by critics. I think it's one of the most interesting things that Waugh ever did, and it's very funny. It's got all sorts of little historical witticisms in it. So that's what that was all about. Favorite biographies of mine. I think the first volume of Ed Morris's Theodore Roosevelt trilogy is terrific. It's the best of the three, I think, by a great margin. So that is certainly one of a political figure. I'd have to run down 2 flights of steps to my basement and look through the 2 bookcases of biographies to come up with. David McCulloch's John Adams is a terrific biography, I think, brilliantly done into a film by HBO. Stephen Ambrose's 2 volumes on Eisenhower, I think, really completed the rehabilitation of Dwight D. Eisenhower as both an enormously important military figure and a quite successful president. McCulloch's Truman is another great biography. So those are some that occur to me right off the top of my head.
And now we know there are more books than the ones behind you in your home.
Well, this is my working library. So this is theology, philosophy, John Paul II stuff, biblical stuff. I'm working on a book on the Second Vatican Council. I've got a whole bookshelf full of material on that behind me. So yeah, this is my study in my house, and this is where the working materials are.
You mentioned about Bill Buckley that his son Christopher said that he once told him that the active life was an antidote to melancholy. I thought that might be really important to sort of end on as we go toward Easter, and people definitely in need of resurrection, and that's something you live by too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not given, I think, to melancholia. I'm given to crankiness, but not so much melancholia. Although I have to say, I am deeply concerned about the future of the country right now. There is a brilliant op-ed piece in today's Wall Street Journal on the Equality Act.
Marty McCarthy.
Yeah, no, it's just terrific.
Yeah.
And she's basically saying, we're being forced to deny reality, and that is lethal to any political community, as any reading of history would tell us. And if I hear one more booby, like my Congressman Jamie Raskin or Dick Durbin, Senator Durbin, quoted in this op-ed today, saying, well, this is just religious prejudice against transgender people. And, religion has been used to cover up people's biases forever. I would remind these men that it was Baptist ministers surrounded by Catholic priests and Jewish rabbis who walked with John Lewis across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And let's cut out the church bashing here.
Let's cut out the church bashing. That seems like a good way to end. I mean, as you talked about earlier, it's our society's denial of God, and which is reality that we've created by something, right? Is a formula for a lot of destruction, as has been the sexual revolution. And again, things that come up in this book by George Weigel, Not Forgotten, Elegies for and Remembrances of a Diverse Cast of Characters, most of them admirable, from Ignatius Press, which is co-sponsoring this hour. Thank you, George, so much for putting the book together, which again, I highly recommend to people. It's accessible, it's encouraging, it's wise and educational, and thanks again for putting it together. And
Kathryn, I hope it's fun too.
it's fun. It is fun too. It is, and we need that. It's a light approach, as you say. They're short remembrances, and you like Bill Buckley had an art for the elegy, the remembrance, the obituary, and you do too. And so I'm really glad that so many of them have been put together in this book, Not Forgotten.
Thank you.
And again, I'm Kathryn Lopez from the National Review Institute, and we were co-sponsoring this with the Ignatius Press, and the NRI, the National Review Institute, is the think tank arm of the National Review world, and we have conferences, and I'm the director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society, so feel free to check us out after you buy George Weigel's book, Not Forgotten. Thank you.